Hello historians, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Prof. J. I am your history professor. In today's presentation, we're going to be taking a closer look at the Hellenistic world. Hellenistic is a word that means to be like Greeks. And the theme for today's presentation is the spread of Greek culture far to the east, as far away as India. How exactly did we get to the point where Greek culture has spread that far from mainland Greece? The story is going to begin with a small kingdom to the north of Greece called Macedon. We're going to take a look at how its king, Philip II, strengthened that kingdom and how his son, Alexander, soon to be known to the world as Alexander the Great, will fulfill his father's dream of taking on and conquering the Persian Empire in one of history's greatest military campaigns. We'll then look at how Alexander's conquests fractured into a number of individual Hellenistic kingdoms after his death in the late 300s BCE. Those Hellenistic kingdoms, as we'll see, depend on important cities to manage and control large swaths of territory. So we'll examine the characteristics of those Hellenistic cities and how they differ from and were similar to the classical Greek city-states that we examined in the Unit 3 presentation. We'll also get into what we today would call scientific discoveries made by important thinkers such as Aristarchus, Eratosthenes, Archimedes, and a couple of others. Speaking of science, we'll examine how science and philosophy began to pull apart from one another during this period of time, as well as what's going on with the philosophies of Stoicism and Epicureanism during the Hellenistic age. We'll also take a brief look at religion centering on mystery cults during the Hellenistic period. And finally, we'll end our look at the Hellenistic world with an examination of Hellenistic art, specifically sculpture, and some of its defining characteristics. Without further ado then, it is time for history, so let's get rolling. Hello historians! In Unit 4 of our look at Western civilization, we'll be discussing the Hellenistic world. If you're a current student of mine, once again there's a forum that accompanies this presentation, so please take a moment to access that forum before we move on. For anyone listening that's not a current student, you can sit back, relax, and get ready to learn. Before we delve into too much detail, it would probably be helpful to explain what the Hellenistic world was and how it came to be. Recall that in Unit 3's lesson, I talked about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Athens' loss in the war broke their confidence and crushed the vibrancy of their democracy. For Sparta, victory yielded no rewards, as it was exhausted from nearly 3 decades of fighting, and soon after the war ended, new challengers emerged. Numerous wars involving Sparta, Athens, Thebes, and Corinth racked Greece for the next 50 years, continuing to weaken everyone. The constant warfare also led to political upheaval, as some city-states succumbed to tyranny and oligarchy. As armies burned enemy fields and plundered the land, farm production declined, with price inflation soon to follow, leading to people starving across Greece, as well as economic decline. Unemployment rose, and Greek troops often sold themselves as mercenaries to the highest bidder. All told, the situation in Greece was dire. It was in this context that just to the north, the kingdom of Macedonia was beginning to stir. Philip II ruled from 359 to 336 BCE. His first order of business was to secure his northern borders against various tribes. Once he had defeated those tribes and expanded his kingdom, Philip benefited from the discovery of new veins of gold and silver, which he used to equip and train a fearsome army. Though he maintained the Greek phalanx, he armed the soldiers with 18-foot-long pikes, allowing Macedonians to attack at a greater distance than a traditional Greek phalanx could. He also supplemented his infantry with cavalry units called the companions. Philip did not initially have his sights set on Greece. Rather, he wanted to invade the Persian Empire, with Athens as an ally whose navy could be used to transport his troops there. Despite his best efforts to secure an alliance, Athens was swayed by political leaders who feared Macedonian power and Philip's ambition, mistakenly believing him to want to conquer all of the Greek city-states. This rejection convinced Philip that before he could mount an invasion of Persia, he needed to secure his homeland, and the only way to do that would be to subdue the Greeks. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 336 BCE, Philip, along with his son Alexander, defeated the combined Athenian-Theban force. Philip, however, would be assassinated 2 years later, leaving the conquest of Greece and Persia to his son, who would later come to be known to history as Alexander the Great. Alexander put down the rest of the Greek threats before invading Persia in 334 BCE. The next year, he won a major battle against a larger Persian force at Issus, after which he proceeded to take city after city in Syria and Palestine. He moved into Egypt unopposed and was hailed as the new pharaoh. He was even proclaimed the son of Zeus by an important oracle. Despite his desire to conquer the rest of the Persian Empire, it would be in Egypt that Alexander would build his greatest city, Alexandria, which would come to be an intellectual and cultural center for decades to come. In 331 BCE, Alexander scored perhaps his most impressive victory, again defeating a much larger Persian force, this time led personally by the Emperor Darius III at Gaugamela, in present-day Iraqi Kurdistan. Darius fled from battle, only to be assassinated by a local war chief who wished to win Alexander's favor. With the demise of Darius, Alexander claimed the title of Great King, a Persian title, and sacked the capital city. He then continued his conquests east, experiencing hard fighting in Afghanistan and into India. Finally, after years of campaigning, marching thousands of miles, fighting innumerable battles, Alexander's men threatened to revolt if the army wasn't turned back for home. Alexander relented, but contracted a fever as they crossed the southern Iranian deserts. They made it as far as Babylon before Alexander succumbed to illness, dying in 323 BCE at the age of 32, having completed one of history's greatest military conquests. Let's pause here for a short review before moving on to the world left behind in the wake of Alexander the Great's death. First, after the Peloponnesian War, the Greek city-states were in shambles and continued to fight each other. Second, Philip II of Macedon built a powerful kingdom with a large army equipped with new weapons that he used to defeat the Greeks in battle. Finally, Philip's son Alexander would invade the Persian Empire, win numerous battles, travel as far as India, but contract a fever that took his life at the age of 32. The conquests of Alexander would result in the spread of Greek culture, ideas, and language across the Eastern world, all the way to India, giving rise to societies that were Hellenistic, meaning like Greeks. This new Hellenistic world would in some ways surpass the classical Greek age that preceded it. Politically, Alexander left no plans for succession, and his conquests split into three primary kingdoms. Egypt, under Ptolemy, was the most successful. Ptolemy tried to avoid wars with the other kingdoms and invested a great deal in the development of science and the preservation of history through the library at Alexandria. The Seleucids controlled the largest of the Hellenistic kingdoms, stretching from the shores of the eastern Mediterranean to Afghanistan. Seleucid monarchs had a tough time trying to establish power in the easternmost regions, and in some cases farmed out control to local chieftains. Seleucid rulers also combined aspects of Greek and Mesopotamian kingship, wearing short, Greek-style hair while adopting titles reminiscent of Mesopotamian kings. The smallest of the Hellenistic kingdoms was the Antigonid kingdom based around Macedonia and Greece. The Antigonids had a certain cachet because they governed the home of Alexander, and they controlled the Greek city-states, still renowned for their culture and history. They also tried to avoid wars with the bigger kingdoms, although they could field the most disciplined and effective army in the Hellenistic world. In response to the Antigonids, the Greek city-states formed various leagues to try to counter Macedonian control and play the various kingdoms off of each other. These leagues were different from past alliances of Greek poli, however, as members were treated as equals rather than one strong city-state taking a leadership role over others. The numerous cities built across the Hellenistic world played an important role in the ability of the monarchs to control their territories and in the continuing development of Greek culture. However, those Hellenistic cities were different in many ways from classical Greek city-states. The first and most obvious difference is that Hellenistic cities existed in the context of kingdoms. Each Hellenistic city was part of a larger political entity, one run by a king, as opposed to the classical Greek polis, which was an independent political unit. Although Hellenistic cities and their leaders had leeway from the kings concerning things happening within the city, they could not control their own, let's call it foreign policy, meaning cities did not get to decide how they interacted with other cities, whether inside or out of their kingdom. Hellenistic monarchs established trade networks and made decisions concerning war and peace, and Hellenistic cities had to follow along. Greek city-states from an earlier time, by contrast, controlled every aspect of their own behavior, including who they would trade with and who they'd fight against. Hellenistic cities were often much larger than their classical Greek counterparts, in some cases as much as 3 times the size. They were also much more cosmopolitan and heterogeneous. This had important political ramifications. One of the strengths of classical Greek city-states was that many people, especially men who could participate in politics, developed strong attachments to their polis. So much so that people identified themselves by which city-state they lived in first, and as Greeks second. Hellenistic cities did not see that level of dedication, partly because the cities were not completely independent and therefore had limited political impact on the larger kingdom, partly because each kingdom had multiple cities united under one polity, as opposed to classical Greek city-states, which were each independent states in their own right, and partly due to the cosmopolitan nature of the Hellenistic cities, which often saw large numbers of foreign people coming and going, not staying long enough to create attachments or maintaining attachments to their homelands instead. Many Hellenistic cities, though, were designed around classical Greek models. From the very layout of the city, to certain buildings, to the architectural styles used to construct and adorn those buildings, they looked a lot like Greek poli. Greek people could immigrate from Athens or Sparta to places in Mesopotamia or even further east, and recognize the physical plan of the city and the buildings therein, getting a taste of home, so to speak, and could attend Greek-style plays put on in Greek-style amphitheaters. They could then go and worship Greek gods in Greek-style temples. Speaking of immigrating, many Greeks, thousands of them in fact, moved from mainland Greece east to find greater opportunities in Hellenistic cities. In fact, between 325 and 225 BCE, the population of Greece fell by 50% as Greek artists, playwrights, sculptors, architects, and other Greeks engaged in nearly every conceivable employment were lured by promises of riches and status by Hellenistic monarchs, who competed against one another to have the best Greek culture money could buy. With the spread of Greek people came the spread of Greek language. So not only could Greeks enjoy Greek plays and Greek gods in places as far away as Afghanistan, they could also speak to other Greeks in Greek. Trade networks emerged between the various Hellenistic kingdoms that furthered the spread of Greek culture throughout the East, and allowed Eastern products and ideas to find their way to Greece. The port city of Alexandria in Egypt, for example, saw gold, tin from as far away as England, elephants and ivory, spices from the Arabian Peninsula, and silk from China pass through it. New cities being constructed across the Hellenistic world also led to new centers of manufacturing. Glass and silver were produced in Syria, Textiles were produced in Pergamum in modern-day Turkey. Alexandria became a hub of parchment, linens, oil, metalwork, and glass. The kings of the Hellenistic world clearly saw the importance of cities to their economic well-being. But cities also played an important political role, especially in larger kingdoms like Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Asia. Cities allowed monarchs to control large tracts of territory, making their kingdoms more secure and extending royal power to all corners of the kingdom. It's no wonder then that during the Hellenistic era, over 200 Greek-style cities were constructed throughout the kingdoms, as a means of establishing political control and creating an environment for economies to flourish, which would then provide monarchs with taxes they needed. However, the prosperity of the Hellenistic kingdoms did not touch everyone. The majority of the people still farmed and barely got by doing so. Those who tried their hand at business and investing often failed, because with so many cities producing so many products, the market for a product could get saturated quickly, causing demand to drop, leading to failed business ventures. Additionally, cities were usually governed by a class of Greeks and Macedonians who preferred Greek culture to that of the local population, at times leading to tension with those who had no power and resented being ruled by foreigners. For natives wishing to gain some power and influence, the only way to do it was to become Hellenized, or to adopt Greek language and customs in order to be accepted. Prosperity and power then were not widespread. That's quite a bit of information on Hellenistic cities, so let's take a breather and review the main points of this section. First, in the wake of Alexander's death, his empire split into kingdoms like Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, and Antigonid Macedonia. Second, Hellenistic cities were built across these kingdoms, usually using Greek plans and containing Greek-style buildings. They were often much larger than classical Greek city-states, but did not see the level of dedication among their people as their classical counterparts. Third, Greeks of various trades and skills were in demand in Hellenistic cities, lured by competing monarchs, and Greece's population dropped 50% due to people seeking more opportunities in the east. Finally, cities proved to be the economic engines of the Hellenistic world, serving as trade and manufacturing centers, and were therefore under the control of monarchs and the upper class, who benefited from such control while most people still barely got by as farmers. An important example of the cosmopolitan nature of the Hellenistic cities was the spread of Greek religion east and the influence of Eastern beliefs on Greeks back home. The Hellenistic world was polytheistic, much like all of the other people we've discussed thus far, with the exception of the Israelites. Many of these different faiths took the form of mystery cults, meaning faiths that had secret initiation rituals known only to members of the cult. In the Hellenistic era, religion and politics weren't as closely linked as they had been previously. In past eras of history, both Greek and non-Greek, religion and politics were often intertwined, as we've seen in previous lessons. The connections between them were at times so strong that religious rules were political rules, and violating the established laws was not only an offense against the state, but an offense against the gods. However, during the Hellenistic age, many people began turning to religion and religious cults as a means of escape from thinking about politics, as well as a means to find connections that the political realm could not provide. The initiation rituals of mystery cults were not only secretive, but highly charged, intense experiences. Traditional Greek religion was very mechanical, very formulaic. Faith did not depend on being good, but rather doing good by the gods, which usually meant partaking in festivals and rituals with rules that had to be meticulously followed. The relationship between gods and humans was transactional. Humans provided worship, prayers, and offerings to the gods, who in return did things for humans. Mystery cults provided people with things traditional Greek faith did not, particularly a personal connection to the deity at the center of the cult, as well as emotional fulfillment. Mystery cults also included the existence of an afterlife that followers could achieve through the cult and its deity. Cults to Osiris and Isis, the Egyptian gods discussed in Unit 1, Mithras, the Iranian god of justice, war, and the sun, and the Greek Dionysus became incredibly popular in the Hellenistic world. Those faiths coexisted with numerous other cults, the pantheon of traditional Greek gods and goddesses, as well as Buddhism in some eastern regions, making the Hellenistic kingdoms very diverse religiously. Before moving on to some cultural developments in the Hellenistic era, let's review what we just learned about religion during this time. First, many people turned to mystery cults with secret initiation rituals as a means of finding the fulfillment traditional Greek religion did not provide for them. These mystery cults existed alongside the Greek gods, as well as Buddhism in some parts of the Hellenistic world. Lastly, part of the reason for the popularity of mystery cults was an emerging separation between religion and politics, and a reluctance among many to participate in the political arena. I mentioned earlier in this presentation that in some ways the Hellenistic world would surpass that of the classical Greeks. In terms of science, medicine, and mathematics, classical Greece has nothing on the scholars of the Hellenistic age. Science and scientific inquiry took on new roles during the Hellenistic age for three main reasons. First, knowledge of math, medicine, and astronomy from places like Egypt and Mesopotamia was combined with some tenets of Greek philosophy and critical examination. Second, the ease with which people could travel across the world and the use of a common language, that being Greek, helped facilitate the spread of ideas and exposed more thinkers and scholars to what others were up to. Finally, science was in vogue as wealthy patrons competed to see who could entice the best scientists, mathematicians, sculptors, architects, and philosophers to their kingdom or their city, and were willing to shell out a lot of money in order to get them. Aristarchus of Samos devised a heliocentric or sun-centered model of the galaxy 1,700 years before Copernicus would theorize such a model. Unfortunately for Aristarchus, another scholar named Ptolemy, no relation to the Egyptian rulers of the day, wrote an influential book that disagreed and instead supported Aristotle's view that the Earth, and therefore human beings, were at the center, and that view would take root for nearly the next 2 millennia. The mathematician Euclid developed a form of geometry, appropriately called Euclidean geometry, that would be in use around the globe until the 20th century. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth to within 200 miles of the actual number, meaning the ancient Greeks understood that the world was, in fact, round, developed a system of latitude and longitude, and also established the science of chronology by attempting to settle the dates of events in Greek history going back to the Trojan War. Eratosthenes also theorized that one could reach Asia by going not east, but by sailing west. In the realms of physics and medicine, one of the most famous Greek inventors of all time, Archimedes of Syracuse, developed experimental physics, devised the theory of specific gravity, and came up with the principles of the lever, pulley, and the screw. Herophilus described the human brain and theorized that it controlled human thought and intellect. He also found that arteries carried blood only, not a mixture of air and blood as theorized by Aristotle, and stated that the pulse could be used to help diagnose what ailed people. Finally, in the realm of the sciences, Erasistratus established that the heart acted as a pump for blood through veins and arteries, described motor and sensory nerves, and argued against the idea that illness in humans was a result of the imbalance of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Unfortunately for Erasistratus, this last idea would be ignored, as for centuries, physicians would use the 4 humors as the basis of human health and medical practice. Science was therefore becoming more experimental, with various practitioners devising ways to test theories and hypotheses in order to discover the various workings of the world. It was stepping away from the abstract theorizing of earlier philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and often being put to more practical uses. For example, Archimedes also developed numerous weapons of war. Philosophy was also changing during the Hellenistic world, but was still in the mode of more abstract ideas. The two dominant schools of philosophy during this time were Stoicism and Epicureanism. Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium. The basic premise of Stoicism was that the universe was rationally ordered, that in the long run, good will ultimately triumph over evil, and that all evil is relative to the person experiencing it. Stoicism also preached that everything, being rationally ordered, was also therefore predetermined, and humans had no actual free will other than to choose to accept their fate or try to fight against it, which would actually be pointless because it's already been determined. Stoicism therefore advocated that people live in conjunction with the natural world and with divine will. It's better to patiently accept your fate and the workings of the world than to stress out trying to fight something that's going to happen. The Stoics, like the Epicureans we'll get to momentarily, were primarily concerned with human happiness and how people can live happy lives. For the Stoics, understanding that there are things in life you can and cannot control, and teaching yourself to accept those you can't, leads to happiness. Learning to accept things takes a good deal of self-discipline, as well as tolerance of others and how they behave, and thus became part of Stoic teachings. Lastly, the Stoics believed that getting involved in political affairs was a good thing, as doing so allowed them to spread and implement their beliefs and try to ensure happiness for more people. The Epicureans, as noted earlier, were also concerned with how humans became happy, but their ideas were nearly the complete opposite of the Stoics. For the Epicureans, whose ideas were founded by Epicurus, the world is not ordered or rational, but is rather chaotic and random. Because of this chaos, the only true path to happiness is simple pleasures, a mind free from worry about things, and a healthy body. For Epicurus, there were three factors that went into human happiness: friends, freedom, and an analyzed life. Epicurus believed that friends were crucial, so much so that he advocated you should never even eat a simple snack without having friends around. He also believed people should be self-sufficient economically and not have bosses pushing them to do things. The Epicureans also believed involvement in public affairs only created worry and stress, which worked against happiness. So in order to truly be happy, you had to separate yourself from all of that. Finally, Epicurus believed that you had to slow down at times and think about the direction in which your life was headed. You had to stop and smell the roses, so to speak, and determine whether or not you were really happy, and how to be so if you felt you weren't. Finally, for Hellenistic culture, let's examine sculpture in the Hellenistic world. In other cultures, like Egypt, sculpture normally depicted powerful individuals, like pharaohs and queens. The normal pose depicted in Kuros statues is the figure depicted standing straight up, with hands held tightly by the sides, and with the left leg slightly forward. If a pharaoh's wife was depicted with him, she was normally portrayed standing next to her husband with one arm wrapped around his back, with the other placed on his arm. Monumental sculpture would depict pharaohs standing, again straight and tall, with arms crossed in front, each hand holding the symbols of royal power, the crook and flail. Other versions had the pharaoh seated, again with straight back and arms resting on either his legs or next to. This formula would not change for centuries. Classical Greek sculpture began moving in the direction of realism. Egyptian Kuros statuary depicted figures as they actually looked, but the poses seemed stiff and staged. Classical Greek sculpture aimed to incorporate Greek ideals of beauty, symmetry, moderation, and proportion. The poses began to be more relaxed, and muscle definition can be seen clearly. Greek sculptors also depicted the male nude, and began depicting gods and men in the midst of movement, as with statues of Zeus in the process of throwing a lightning bolt. Hellenistic sculpture, meanwhile, moved away from those ideals of symmetry and moderation and took realism nearly to the extreme. The movement depicted is nearly unnatural, as seen in the sculpture Laocoon and His Sons. Laocoon tried to warn the Trojans about the deception of the Greeks with the Trojan horse, and was punished by the god Poseidon, who sent serpents to kill him and his sons. You can clearly see bodily contortions all three men are going through as they try to fight off the attack. The piece is quite a bit different from the Egyptian Kuros statues, more vivid, more emotional, more extreme, more evocative. Hellenistic art was able to experiment because, just as with scientists and philosophers, wealthy patrons sought to bring the best to their kingdom or city, and also wanted one-of-a-kind pieces. The latitude they gave their artists allowed them to experiment with new designs, to be bold and test the limits of what their audience would accept. Hellenistic art would prove to be a great influence centuries later during the Italian Renaissance, especially on famous artists like Michelangelo. It's time for our final review before this presentation comes to an end. First, the combination of Greek and Eastern knowledge, the spread of Greek language, and the desires of the wealthy led to important developments in science, such as determining the circumference of the Earth, developing a heliocentric universe, and discovering important principles of the lever and pulley. Second, science and philosophy began to separate, as philosophy was still more abstract, and thinkers like Zeno and Epicurus developed philosophies that tried to explain what made people happy, though they went in different directions with their suggestions. Lastly, Hellenistic sculpture moved in the direction of dramatic movement and expression of emotion, making it quite different from Egyptian statuary and even from earlier Greek sculpture. That wraps things up for Unit 4. In this lesson, we've examined how Hellenistic cities were different from Greek city-states. We've explored the purpose of mystery cults in the Hellenistic world. We also looked at how philosophy and science began to diverge. Finally, we took a look at how sculpture in the Hellenistic world was different from that of other people we've studied. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below or send me an email if you are a current student. Additionally, if you'd like to know more about the topics discussed in this presentation, here are some books you can check out to get started. Once again, don't be a jerk in my comment section. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next video.